Hi everybody, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be learning how to make and can elderberry syrup. I remember when I started making elderberry syrup almost a decade ago, my Oma said to me that I did things the old way. And that really warmed my heart. And she proceeded to tell me the stories of what it was like growing up in Western Germany. And when her and her sister and brother, came down with something, the first thing their mom would do is go for the elderberry juice. Now, times have changed a little bit in the sense that people want stuff that is a little bit more ready to use and shelf stable. So we've kind of transitioned to elderberry syrup. Whereas a juice, you can use the same protocols that we'll be learning about today to make juice. You just wouldn't add any honey to it. Is a perfectly acceptable alternative, but you're only going to get about maybe 3 to 5 days in the fridge before it starts to turn kind of funky on you. Whereas if you make elderberry syrup like I teach you today, you'll have about 2 to 3 months of shelf life with this product. So this recipe that I will be teaching you today is available in my book. It's also, I've got an old blog post that I'll link below so you can check it out there. And if the idea of making elderberry syrup seems overwhelming or challenging, I have really easy to follow DIY kits that will yield a single jar of elderberry syrup. Now, the reason why people really love this kind of old-time remedy is because elderberries are loaded with vitamin C, polyphenols, anthocyanins, all those wonderful things that we need. It's an excellent anti-inflammatory. Elderberries themselves have antiviral properties as well as immune stimulating properties. So you can imagine that, if you're feeling under the weather in any way, shape, or form, this is a great remedy to turn to. It even has some mild expectorant properties. So while it's not a cough syrup itself, it is going to help to kind of loosen that mucus and phlegm and allow you to expel it from the body, because we never want to suppress cough. Coughing is a mechanism by which the body's trying to get rid of something. What a lot of people like about elderberry syrup, as long as there's no added herbs to it, other than the ones I'll discuss today, it's safe for children. It's safe for those who have any chronic illness, who are on medications. You can combine it with homeopathy. There really isn't a lot of contraindications other than if you were to say chug the whole jar. That would be a really high content of vitamin C and it would probably irritate your bowels a little bit. Of course, if you are on any immunosuppressant medication for any reason, you never want to take an immune stimulant. So without further ado, we're going to get on to making elderberry syrup. So to make basic elderberry syrup, you really only need 3 ingredients. That's elderberries, either fresh or dried, water, and honey. I have some optional ingredients here that I always include when I'm making elderberry syrup, and one of them is ginger root. You can use powdered ginger, you can use fresh ginger root, which is my preference, but when I can't get organic fresh ginger root, I have organic dried ginger root. Cinnamon. Cloves are an option too, and I really like adding some elderflower as well. And I will go through all of the amounts, but like I said, there will be a blog post that has my recipe. You can grab a copy of my book. I have an entire section on cold and flu remedies, so it really is a handy little reference to have around. I'm going to be making quite a large batch of elderberry syrup today, but I will let you know the amounts you'll need just to make a single portion, which would be a 250 milliliter jar. So I'm blessed that I have lots of fresh elderberries on the property. So what I do is I pick them all in August and I freeze them. And so today what I'm using are frozen fresh elderberries. And they have this beautiful color. I'll get my husband to zoom in and hopefully you can see. So if you're using fresh elderberries, to make 1 jar of elderberry syrup, you're going to need 1 cup of fresh berries. If you're using dried, you want to use half a cup of dried berries. Like I said, today I'm making quite a large amount, so I'm going to be needing 8 cups of elderberries. So I'll get those measured out and into my giant cauldron here. And I often get this question, why do we use less berries if we're using dried? And the reason for that is when we are using fresh, we're compensating. Oh, this was 8 cups. I didn't need the other bag. Awesome. We're compensating for the water content in the fresh berries. So because the dried elderberries have been dried, there is no water content left in them and we use less. That's a pretty standard procedure when you're making anything with herbs. I'm also going to point out that you're going to see a color difference between using fresh berries and dried berries. When a plant is dried, it is exposed to oxygen and oxidizes. So your elderberry syrup is going to be darker if you use dried berries, and it's going to be more of a lighter purple if you use fresh. Neither is wrong. It really doesn't matter. You're getting the same kind of medicine, but I always like to point that out to folks because sometimes they wonder, oh, did I do something wrong because my elderberry syrup is so much lighter? If you decide to use fresh elderflower or dried elderflower, you're going to use about 2 tablespoons. So that's what I'm adding in now is my elderflower. And of course, because I'm making a large batch, I need a full cup of this beautiful medicine. So if you're buying store-bought elderberry syrup and you see ingredients like echinacea, ashwagandha, astragalus, you're going to want to do a little bit more research as to whether or not that's safe for you because those plants do have some contraindications. Next, I'm going to be adding ginger root. If you're using fresh ginger root, I use about a teaspoon of fresh grated. And if you're using dried, about 1/8 of a teaspoon. Dried powder works. I add about 2 big tablespoons. And this is my dried organic ginger root that I buy in bulk for my DIY kits, as I showed you guys those before. So I'll be adding those in. If you choose to add cinnamon, for 1 jar of elderberry syrup, you're looking at 1 cinnamon stick. I also have these cinnamon chips, which are really, really nice. If you decide to use cinnamon chips, you probably want about 2 teaspoons of cinnamon chips, maybe a bit more. A lot of this is to taste. There's really no wrong way to do this. If you don't like cinnamon or you're allergic, don't add it. If you love cinnamon and you love spice, add extra cinnamon and ginger. There's nothing wrong with that either. You can also add cloves, you can add allspice. All of those herbs are a really beautiful, warming, pungent kind of alternative. So now that we have all of our ingredients in here, you're going to need to add your water. So for every 1 cup of fresh elderberries or 1/2 cup of dried, you're going to be adding 3 cups of good, clean drinking water. So I'm just adding the last of my water here. And in case you didn't see my correction that I made on the screen, this makes 500 milliliters of elderberry syrup. My apologies. If you want to make larger batches like I am, and you plan on canning it, all you have to do is double, triple, or quadruple the recipe. It's the same ratios all the time. So I'll go over those again really quickly. You're either going to need a 1/2 cup of dried or 1 cup of fresh elderberries, 3 cups of water. You're going to want, now again, this is personal preference, 1 cinnamon stick or whatever the equivalent is to that. Either 1/8 of a teaspoon of dried ginger or about a teaspoon of grated fresh ginger. You can add about 3 cloves if you choose, and up to 2 tablespoons of elderflowers. And that again is to make 1 500 milliliter jar of elderberry syrup. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring this over to the stove and I'm gonna bring this to a full roaring boil, and then I'm immediately gonna drop it down to a simmer. And then you want your elderberry syrup to simmer. In this case, you're really just making elderberry juice or decoction at this point. You want it to simmer for at least 30 minutes, but again, make sure you turn that heat down to fairly low, because if you keep it cranked up really high, your yield's gonna be a lot lower because you're gonna evaporate off a lot of water. So if you plan on canning your elderberry syrup, like I am, while your syrup is simmering is a great time to wash and prep your jars. Now, if you're not familiar with the changes in canning protocols that the awesome canning science people came up with, I think it was about 7 years ago, if your processing time for water bath canning is greater than 10 minutes, you don't need to sterilize your jars anymore. They discovered that they self-sterilize during the canning process, which I mean is wonderful and fabulous and makes so much less work for us. So what I do is I pre-wash my jars, and then I have them up on this fancy little rack here that I'll just let them sit until I'm ready. And right before I'm about to can my elderberry syrup, I'll get a pot of really hot boiling water in my kettle going, and I'll pour boiling water over the jars right before I put the syrup in them. The reason I do this is to acclimatize the jars to the hot temperature they're about to be exposed to, so that way you don't have to worry about any cracking or anything. So like I said, this is a great time to get your jars and lids prepped. They also, you no longer have to simmer your lids, guys. If you're still doing that, they've actually cheaped out on the rubber in the lids. And if you boil your lids, you could melt the rubber, which is really kind of crappy. So you could, if you wanted to, keep them on a very low simmer on your stovetop. That's perfectly fine. But I just wash them with really hot water. And if canning seems super intimidating to you and you're like, I have no idea what this lady's talking about, but you want to learn, I encourage you to check out my canning webinar. I'll put a link to that below. I ran it probably about 6 months ago, and I cover everything, including pressure canning, common canning mistakes, myths, and anything like that. So I'm going to get to washing the rest of my jars, and I'll see you in a bit. So while your syrup is simmering for your at least 30 minutes, I like to do about 30 to 45 minutes, you want to make sure that you're stirring every now and again, and you want to try to release as much juice from the berries as possible. So you can use a wooden spoon like this, and you can kind of smash the berries up against the side of the pot like that. Or if you have a potato masher, you could use that as well. That works really, really well. You just want to try to release as much juice as possible. You don't have to stir constantly. You know, you can definitely walk away from this, but you want to try to release some of that juice. So like I said, either the back of your wooden spoon, or you can use a potato masher. So still steaming. As you can see, my elderberry syrup is done simmering. So basically what you have here is known as a herbal decoction. So when we add barks and berries and twigs and those parts of plants and we simmer them on the stove top, that's a decoction. When you pour hot water over more fragile parts like flowers and leaves, we call that a tea or an infusion. So what you want to do now is strain your elderberry decoction. And you have a few options on how to do this. It depends on how much work you want, how messy it's going to be, all those types of things. If you do decide to use cheesecloth and actually wring it out to get as much juice out as possible, you'll obviously want to wait until this cools down. My favorite tool is my handy dandy potato ricer. And I highly recommend you check out my video I did on herbal equipment. I think, yeah, post it up here, and it goes over all of the must-haves, would be nice to have, and gee golly, if I had all the money in the world, I'd buy one of these. But my potato ricer has been with me for a long time. I use it for making tinctures or pressing tinctures and elderberry syrup, because you can strain a lot of juice out of it. It looks kind of like a big giant garlic press, and then you squeeze it down and all the juice comes out. Because of the giant holes on the side, I will strain it back a second time. So I'm going to move the elderberry decoction from this pot to here. And then you can use something like a mesh sieve to catch any of the other parts. I tend to do 3 strains. The third one is when I'm actually pouring the syrup into the jar for canning. So again, I just take, there's my elderberry decoction. I'm going to pour it through my potato ricer. I'll do this a few times, making sure I get enough berries. And it's so hot. I used to wait until it cooled down, but now I'm far too impatient for that. I just be careful, make sure I'm careful when I'm doing this. And then I don't want to fill it all the way, just because it does make quite a bit of a mess. And I just squeeze, and then you can see how much more juice I'm able to get out if I squeeze it. And then the elderberry mash, you can compost it, or if you have animals on your farm or homestead like we do, you can feed the elderberry mash to the chickens. Once your elderberries are cooked, there's no worries about any toxicity. The berries do contain trace amounts of cyanide, which cook off as soon as you cook them in any way, shape, or form. So you never want to eat raw elderberries, guys. And the cyanide components are actually most concentrated in the stems and roots. So like I said, I'm not going to make you watch me strain all of my elderberry decoction at this point. Once I'm done, I'll show you what the next steps are. So after you have your elderberry decoction completely filtered and all of the berries strained out, the next step to make a syrup is adding honey. Now, if you want to can it just like this as a juice, you absolutely can. Canning protocols call for 15 minutes for 500 milliliter jars. That's, of course, if you are at sea level. Make sure you guys do your adjustments if you are above sea level. Just know that once you open the jar, you have about, like I said, 3 to 5 days before homemade natural juice starts to turn a little skunky. The honey is what allows it to be preserved and also creates the syrup compound. So a decoction plus honey equals syrup. And so the amount is very much to taste and what you desire. I recommend anywhere from half a cup to 1 cup of honey for every 500 milliliter jar you're making. Again, I'm doing a much larger quantity, so I'm going to be adding 8 cups of honey here. Now, I use raw local honey, but of course, because I'm canning it, the honey is no longer raw. So that's one of the downsides of canning elderberry syrup. However, one of the plus sides is usually when people aren't feeling well, the last thing they want to do is make a batch of elderberry syrup. So if you've got sick little ones in the house, sometimes it's nice just to be able to go to the pantry, grab a jar, and it's already done for you. So one of the benefits of not canning it is that your honey will remain raw, which is a really nice added bonus. So if you're not going to be canning your elderberry syrup, all you need to do is add some honey, stir it around, make sure it's well incorporated, and your job is done. So I'm going to finish up adding my honey, and then I will explain the canning process after that. So I've got my elderberry syrup back on the stove here. If you're going to be canning it, you want to bring it back up to a boil. Whenever we can anything, if you guys are familiar with canning, you know that everything goes into those jars hot, hot, hot. So while I'm waiting for this to come back up to a boil, this is the perfect time for me to fill my kettle and get boiling water ready to pour over my jars, because once this is at a boil, that's when I'll start filling up my jars. I also have my water bath canner here, and I'll have that kind of on a medium simmer, getting ready to can my syrup. So my syrup has come to a nice boil, and I have poured boiling water over my jars so they are nice and hot. The other ones are sitting in the sink with boiling water in them. I forgot to mention this during the part where I was washing them, but you always want to check the rims of your jars to make sure that there's no nicks or any cracks in the top, because that's one of the reasons why you may experience seal failure. So this is when I do my third strain, and I've got a couple cloths here. You always want to make sure you have clean cloths to wipe your rims. But I'll do a third strain here just to get any last little bits out before I can the syrup. So I like using a measuring cup. It does make it a little bit messy. So like I said, that's why I have a cloth here just to catch any of the mess. And then you pour in your syrup. This is not the same as having to do things like peaches or pickles where you have to worry about air bubbles. Canning liquid is super awesome. So then I'll just move that over to my next jar. Whoop. And that's where you're going to take your clean cloth. Some people like to use a cloth with a bit of vinegar on it. And you're going to wipe your rim. Make sure there's nothing that's going to come in between your rim and your lid. And you'll place your clean canning lid on. And then you're going to screw on your screw band fingertip tight. So what that means is you don't want to screw it on too tight. And then you put it in your canning rack. And then I just repeat this process over and over again until I have a full rack, which is about 9. The processing time for elderberry syrup is 15 minutes. So again, that's the reason why we didn't have to pre-sterilize our jars. Any processing time above 10 minutes, you don't have to sterilize, and for pressure canning, you don't have to either. Of course, you want to wash them with hot soapy water, and you want to make sure your jars are nice and hot, but no need to go do that extra step of sterilizing. So I'll show you guys that one more time. I'm going to take my clean cloth, I'm going to wipe the rim, make sure there's nothing in between, and you can feel too that there's no cracks. These are brand new jars. You'll place your lid on, and then carefully seal, fingertip tight, and place it on your canning rack. So I've got my jars all filled, and I'm going to take my canning rack and try not to trip over my mic cord and get it in the canner. So you always want to have, I've got quite a bit of water in the canner. You always want to have at least 1 to 2 inches of water above your jars. And I always make sure that my canner is nice and hot when I put the jars in. If you put your jars in when the water is really cold, you risk cracking your jars. So always make sure it's at least warm or hot. And once it comes, you put your lid on, and once it comes to a nice rolling boil, that's when you start your timer. So again, for elderberry syrup, it's the same protocols as juice, so you're looking at 15 minutes canning time. So my jars are done in the canner. I like to let them kind of sit just for a couple minutes to acclimatize to the difference in temperature outside of the canner versus in. And it really does help to have proper canning supplies. You don't need them, but these guys I think are like $4 or $5 at your local hardware store. And it certainly does make lifting the jars out easier. So you want to put them in a spot where they're not going to be disturbed for at least 24 hours. So kitchen table, probably not the best location. After about an hour, I test the lids to see if they have sealed. And if any of them haven't, you can either reprocess them in the canner or you can choose just to pop them into the fridge. I have found that after about an hour or so, if the lid hasn't sealed, it's not going to seal. And if you leave it out for the full 24 hours and catch it only then, you've had food out at room temperature for 24 hours, which means you're going to have to throw it out. So I always like to check. You don't disturb the jar. You just kind of push down on the top of the lid. And if there isn't any give, if it's not bouncing at all, then you've got seal, or your jars have sealed properly. So I'm going to remove the rest of these. And that's pretty much it for the canning process. You want to make sure that when you store them, you take the rings off. And you want to label your jars so you know what's in them. You know, there's nothing worse than heading out into the pantry and you got a whole bunch of jars of stuff and you didn't label any of them. I like to label the tops of the lids with permanent marker. So that's one way to do it, or you can print off fancy labels if you plan on giving these as gifts. Elderberry syrup is always a welcome gift this time of year. But like I said, you want to take the rings off, just wash and wipe your jars down after the 24-hour period, and then store them in a cool and dark location until you're ready to use them. So there you have it, folks, 15 beautiful jars of elderberry syrup fresh out of the canner. So again, if you are new to canning and all of this seems really overwhelming to you, I do have a webinar. I'll make sure I'll place that link below. The recipe for this is either in my book, you can find it on my website as well. Either of those options work really, really well. If you have any questions or comments about either the canning process for canning elderberry syrup or elderberries in general, you can leave comments below. And until next time, this is Corinne from Spiraea Herbs, wishing you health and wellness.